It is recording now, so you can do the introductions to the legal
All right.
part.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. This is the working group serving autoscaling workstream. We are here today to do a deep dive on warm pooling as an experiment in how we want to structure our meetings and to generate some ideas. This code of conduct applies. Thank you all. Okay, the notes are in the doc. Just I'll link that in the chat just so everybody has access to it. You have to be a member of working group serving to comment. But okay, so we've had a couple discussions. Autoscaling considered inclusive of both the improvements to autoscaling as well as the improvements to workload startup. So making it faster for workloads to start up, large accelerated models start up slowly. There have been various techniques discovered. A few people have suggested warm pooling. And so we wanted to try to dive deep on specifically what we can do to amortize workload startup. And then in the agenda, I did make a note on it would be desirable to maybe review a few other techniques before the end of the hour. So with that in mind, at least maybe go around for folks who had warm pooling discussions on their own. One of the ones that I was considering, there's a couple layers, there's nodes and pods. If you have a node available, what can you do to amortize startup? If you don't have a node available, keeping one warm could mean multiple things. So maybe like we can orient on definitions here. Just jot some notes as we go. So and then
yeah, so while you're typing there, as you said, conversations away from this working group. So I'm the maintainer for the node feature discovery, and the other day someone from the Autoscaler project came to the node feature discovery chat, and they were asking like, what if we use the node feature discovery like in reverse? Like instead of waiting for NFD to place labels on a node, we will create the node. So NFD, the node feature discovery allows you to create node objects that are called a node feature. So it's one per node. So this person from the Autoscaler team was saying like, hey, what if we create a node feature and then it's up to a controller to say like, oh, that node doesn't exist, and then it will like pre-warm that node based on a pre-definition of the node. That was a nice conversation. If the thread, I'm going to paste the thread here in the document. So that's like one nice idea on how to pre-warm, because the API of NFD allows you to be like very specific on like the type of node and even the type of system that you want on the node. So it'd be a good way to define a node for pre-warming.
So this would be actually going and creating a node object with the labels and stuff that you want on it as a way of describing an intent to a cluster autoscaler?
Yes.
Okay. So it's effectively a spec using the node object with feature detector labels to create okay. Certainly, and then we should talk about like the autoscalers, node autoscalers create nodes and then clean them up. Having an unambiguous, so what you described, I think, Eduardo, like from a terminology perspective, that's a signal. So it's a declarative signal to that a specific. Obviously, one characteristic of that is you need a signal to then keep that node around. So signals, creating a pod today is the signal. to the cluster autoscaler. And then the signal to remove a node is, there's actually, depending on what configuration you have, there's multiple signals, but I would say, absence of a pod, pod deletion, etc., is viewed as a signal to autoscaler to spin down nodes. And then there's also the cluster autoscaler can repack, descheduler can repack. Both of those signals are kind of weaker, but let's call this the repack signal. And I don't know if anybody has a stronger terminology set, I'm reasonably familiar with both the autoscaling groups, but I may have missed some. I don't know, Ray, if there's a terminology that you think is better than signal, or if we've got more precise terms, because I would like to make sure that we're being representative of the terminology that would be used in the autoscaling groups.
Yeah, it's a good question, Clayton. I think you are using the right terminology for now. I don't know if, Guy, you have other thoughts here, but I think this is okay for now.
I think for scale up signal I don't think we've really agreed or aligned on between cluster autoscaler and Carpenter on a term so much for scale up.
Okay. Yeah, scale up is actually scale up is maybe the type of signal.
Yeah.
And then yes, scale down, and I think repack. Ultimately, descheduler was there was a bunch of discussions in the early days, and we chose descheduler and not to integrate it with the scheduler, unlike some previous systems where the scheduler might make decisions about where capacity isn't freed up. So we decided to create a separate component that would be responsible, or we would say that the scheduler does not own the responsibility to deschedule, and that would be other components, autoscalers, the descheduler itself, which was not an exclusive grant of that permission. I think, if we survey the space today, some other terminology that we've been using is we're reactive, both in HPA and CA, and I guess Carpenter, is it fair to call Carpenter reactive? It reacts to a pod signal.
You could create a node claim, I think, with Carpenter that would trigger creating a node without having a pod, I think. It's
a new signal type, but that's a reactive. The Carpenter is not acting to anticipate future demands. Okay. So we'll call that another signal.
Like the provisioning request and the node claim APIs, I think are.
And then provisioning request from Q, is that a signal as well? Would we call that a scale-up signal?
Provisioning request is actually from cluster autoscaler, it's not Q.
Okay.
Yeah, and node claim from Carpenter. I think they both have the same purpose.
Yeah, we're working on aligning those two between the two projects.
So let's call this the scale-up node signal today is being worked on to align. And I think that in the scope of this, at least in my head, all pooling basically boils down to you implicitly or explicitly decide to pay a higher cost. Like if you've got autoscaling on, the assumption is the autoscaler is working to minimize the cost. The autoscaler has heuristics that are applying logic. As a user, you're doing things that hold that capacity, which means you're working against the autoscaler. So the natural place for the autoscaler policy is on the node level, and then I think this is the key tension that we talk about a lot, which is Kubernetes is about workloads. The signal, the dominant signal is pod, which is a part of a workload, but it's a reactive signal. What is the role, 15 minutes in, what is the role of the workload definition and specifying, recording the intent? And workload definition could be deployment or workload controllers. It could also be HPA policy, or it could also be pod disruption budget. Those are kind of our three main objects today that express policy about intent of the workload and its size. You could also maybe say like we're missing some hypotheticals. In all of those cases, there's no actual way today on any of those objects that any system is using to explicitly say, hold more of these around to amortize startup. And let's go down the list in order. Sorry, I don't know what the order is.
Yeah, I think it was me. I think I'm back, but my voice is a little bit
You sound sick,
groggy,
Sergey.
so yeah, please excuse my voice. I have two topics to add. First is, do you want to, like, it's more of a batch topic. Do you want to think of scheduling something on a node while it's still working on previous batch? So like amortizing in the sense that you start preparing the next pod while you still finishing up the current pod. So that may improve some situation. And we've been talking about in the past about sending a pod to the node while some other pod in graceful termination, but maybe we can go even further and say like it's not even graceful termination, but maybe even further than that. It's also a good thing to warm up something. And in the sense of inference, do you want to talk about preemption? Like, can we actively preempt something that is cheap to start in order to start something that's expensive to start, but we know that it will start faster on this node?
I think so. And, maybe, given this is a pretty rich topic, so I actually would say, 15 minutes in, I'm actually pretty excited about having, an hour-long talk about this. Is there maybe this is good, this is our first time doing it. Is there any forum that folks are aware of where people are talking about proactive workload-driven scheduling or expressing the policy or the batch stuff beyond what we've raised so far? Are these discussions happening in some other place that we should be joining those people?
I don't think so.
Okay.
It's not fully dedicated to, but there are ongoing discussions between sort of cluster autoscaler and Carpenter teams, which are touching on some of these themes as well.
And I think it's ultimately the ownership of those belongs to those two groups, but it's maybe that we would say, okay, it's okay for us to have like a really workload, especially an inference workload focused, but also I think, Sergey, your example of batch or serving is like, for instance, when we do surge from a deployment controller, we know that the moment a deployment starts rolling out, we're going to need excess capacity in the cluster. Would that help the signal? I think that's the analogy to your first point, Sergey, and then preemption. Eduardo?
I think my idea builds on top of Sergey, and I was thinking like, what if we build or like just take on what the queue concept is of using pause, right? So queue uses the pause mechanism to like pause and unpause jobs before going and being deployed. Like, what if we can do like a pause, right? Like quote unquote pause into the cluster autoscaler, but instead of the word pause being like pre-warm, but we can also use that and then attach it as a label or an annotation to the next job that is in the queue of queue, right? That way we could then build on top of queue with like even the preemption. So queue is queue knows that some nodes are going to be pre-warmed or like created, and then it tags the jobs that are on queue, saying like, okay, you are going to be run once these nodes are like pre-warmed, right? So
so maybe so this is like a great scope question. Is that queue's responsibility? So maybe like, and this is actually like, I think this is the discussion we're trying to have, is what you've described is the mechanism whereby queue, which has a time fungibility component and an ordering mentality, like queue can apply a mentality of order and prioritization among a class of workloads that opt in. There's another dimension, which is declaratively, do existing workloads represent a policy intent that we could be inferring from, right? Like if I have workloads with an HPA on them, if I have two workloads with an HPA, and that HPA max replicas is a certain amount, do I know things about that from the operation of HPA that can be used to better inform some component? So like an example would be like, we kind of hit about Sergey had the example about fast startup and preemption. In my head, like a little bit is HPA knows exactly how long workloads take to start up in reaction to a startup signal. Workloads know how long they should start up. There's a rich set of data on the cluster already, even for existing workloads, that says, in practice, we should have a rough idea of what the start time of every workload is. Do those express an intent as well? What additional intent do we need to capture? And then, so Abdullah, can you expand on the reservations point? I'm going to copy this into the notes, because I think we're in I think given that what we have today, like we've justified a follow-up meeting where we spend a lot more time, but like we're kind of, let's get the topics up, think about them, and then be ready to go into the next meeting with like a breath. We'll do the breath here where we kind of just get some of the threads going.
Yeah, so this is like an old idea that we discussed, but we didn't really execute on. It's basically, how do we? It's along the lines of provisioning request as well, like a node claim, but it's at the subnode level, right? Like it's not necessarily like you are trying to request a node, but you're actually trying to trigger provisioning resources, but also reserve some of it. Think of it as like taints, but not on the whole node, but at like on a core or a GPU. But the idea here is, again, like it could help you to try to trigger this, anticipating, a way to declare that I'm anticipating, a spike, for example, and I want to trigger whether it's provisioning new resources or even reserve some of the ones that already exist until like the actual spike happens.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Eduardo.
Yeah, the other thing that I'm thinking on whatever we end up defining as an API is like we should have a set of items that we agree upon on, like if I'm pre-warming nodes, what does it mean, right? Like, because pre-warming is not just creating a resource, right? Like I feel that we're just talking about resources, but like in that signal of pre-warming, we should be able to say like, okay, pre-warm it, and please be pulling this image while you are ready, right? Like, so once the node is ready, what is the definition of ready, right? Like ready is that I already have the image pre-pull, I already have maybe some dependency already installed, I am attached to the storage, right? Like, what is the definition of ready?
And it's actually interesting. So like, one of the things, and Ray and I had chatted about this, like kind of playing through the idea that if, like I was kind of trying to get, like somebody ultimately is deciding to pay cost. A lot of what Cube does today is people tell us what they want and then we go accomplish it. And then we try to work around what they've told us to infer additional signals. So like if I say I want a pod, Cluster Autoscaler goes, you must want a node to run that pod on. And now we're starting to move into provisioning requests. Q says, I want to run all these jobs. As you say, Eduardo, like Q can create like an overtime understanding. But one of the things that I wanted to at least have us probe would be, why are we setting this on node level, right? It's like nodes have all these like min replicas, like different auto-scaling systems. Like, I'm familiar with both OpenShifts and GKEs, like both had cluster lifecycle had min replicas on a node pool. The moment you have min replicas, you're effectively saying, as an admin, I'm making a capacity decision to hold and pool resources vastly decoupled from the actual workload, right? The workload team has no control. The admin is just like, yeah, let's just spin up like 30 nodes or so. That's probably right. It's such an inelegant and it's an action at a distance, right? But it matches the problems that a platform admin has. A platform admin is responsible for ensuring that capacity. They're responsible for controlling cost. I think one of the things, like Ray and I was like, could we move that intent up a level so that you would say, yeah, I want this workload to start faster. And the aggregate of those intents helps you define you know, how many extra nodes should be left around, right? It could be a signal to autoscaler, it could be a signal to proactive, whatever. The downside of that, which I think we should discuss, would be it's not the simplest way to represent something. And so this is like the tension Cube is always in, is we put nodes in Cube, platform admins own nodes. And so everybody thinks about nodes as your primary articulable resource because that's what you pay for and that's what you provision. We think about like where we're going, what are the limits of that, and how would we build, like, not just like Eduardo, I think, like define what the set of signals are, but maybe our remit should be to define the new signal types that can complement the existing knobs that people have, that then allow us in the future to reduce some of the pain of turning those knobs. So like maybe, I'll write this down, but it'd be like, how would we have a new signal that removes some of the urgency for you to set min replicas on node pools, or, you know, whatever your autoscaler. Like we have min replicas on HPA because people don't trust HPA, not to screw you. Is there a, like when we think about pooling, why do we have min replicas? It's to make sure that you can react quick enough to a burst in traffic because startup time is fundamental. Is there a better way than min replicas? People like safety blankets. Like you can't take away someone's safety blanket, especially 10 years into Cube. How could we complement the safety blanket, right? Like if you trust us with the with a new field, how would we get there? So we're going to run out of time. Anybody have any key topics? So like we're going to do a follow-up. I think we want to go deeper. We've kind of gone breadth. We've talked about signals and definitions. We've listed a bunch of ideas. Can we take 2 action items, maybe a few volunteers to like think about categorizing the signals, and then a few people to add their additional ideas, maybe to a list. Like I'd like to figure out how to come into the next meeting primed to like really brainstorm some ideas together, or do we want to just do another brainstorming session? Who cares? Who is very eager to go generate ideas and bounce them off people? Put it that way. Yeah, I think. Okay, Ray, go ahead.
I mean, I like this brainstorming. I feel like we're uncovering things we haven't been thinking about. That being said, we could probably classify what we've talked about already today, and then maybe that will feed more. So I kind of like that idea. Maybe even if it's just super quick, right? So I'm happy to volunteer.
Okay, Ray, is there one other person who wants to like partner with Ray to like generate some brainstorm stuff to go into the next session with, and maybe like we try to review before it? So like, let's say we schedule it for next week. We go into that with at least some ideas on paper that we're all prepared to talk about. I know this is, I'm asking, I think like I'm perfectly willing to work with Ray as well, but I don't know if there's anybody who's as passionate about this as I am. I'll work with Ray.
I mean, like,
we'll
I would love to help. I would love to help, but right now I'm in an airport, so like, I'm flying back. Like, if I made it on time, I'll ping you, right? But yeah.
So Ray, why don't you, if you can at least get like like to help format this, I'll come in and add comments, Eduardo, and then we'll try to send that out ahead of time so that we get in brainstorming, and I'll schedule brainstorming for next week, maybe an hour.
Yep, sounds good.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. This is good. I feel like, you know, we're just getting started. I really want to keep diving, but we'll do better on timing next time.
Thanks.